I would like to start this session on value for money by the International Development Select Committee. We're very fortunate to be joined by Sarah. I wonder, Sarah, if you could introduce yourself and the work you've been doing, please.
Thank you so much for having me today. It is a real pleasure to be part of this conversation at such a critical time for international development. My name is Sarah Annable-Gardner and I am proudly founder and chief executive of Action to Enterprise. We are a small charity working in rural Ghana, which I set up after spending a year as a VSO volunteer there in 2012. We set the charity up because local people had clearly and repeatedly told me what they wanted to do to improve their lives and break the cycle of poverty. So we started off by feeding a school, supporting some disabled children and setting up a handful of businesses. It went surprisingly well. I gave up my job as a primary school teacher, and now I'm really proud to run an ambitious small charity which is growing quickly and supporting tens of thousands of people across Upper West Ghana. Just this year we have expanded to the district to the north of where we originally started working, in Nandam, which is on the border with Burkina Faso, which has gone extremely well, and we're ambitious to grow into the future. At this end of our link, I have a wonderful long-term support base in our rural community in Wiltshire, which we have engaged with tangible change, proving that it is possible to excite people about international development, which is happening a long way away from them.
Sarah, what do you actually do?
We have, that's a really good question. So we have a fantastic model, we call it our hub model, which works in ultra-rural communities, supporting children into education, disabled children to thrive, and entrepreneurs to set up businesses. We run these projects together in ultra-rural communities, being managed by a local hub manager from that community. So we work through community meetings from the outset, finding out what people need to access education, business, and for inclusion. We've got 6 hubs across Laura now, impacting 37% of the whole district, which is 50,000 people. So we're impacting 21,000 people now in Laura, and we plan to by 2028 to be impacting 50,000 people across the Upper West. So we've been honing this model over the first decade of our work, and we have found that it has a tremendous ripple effect. We originally go for depth, so we impact individuals, children to get to schools, entrepreneurs to run fantastic small businesses, children to be accepted into society. But what we see quickly happens is, although we're going in for individuals, that impact ripples out and impacts whole communities.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Can I pass you over to David?
Thank you, Chair. Sarah, lovely to see you again. It was fascinating hearing about your work recently when we met, and to hear about how you built Action Through Enterprise over the last decade and the important work you're doing. But for the benefit of the committee, would it be possible to sort of briefly describe what the benefits are of passing local decision making to actors around development projects?
Yeah, absolutely. We have found that really our work is only successful when it is led by people on the ground, which is why we've now got nearly 50 staff in Upper West Ghana who are doing the work in their local language, in their local communities. We work through community meetings from the onset, so we ask people what they need to succeed. We listen to them, which of course is difficult. It can be time consuming, but it is actually free. And when we hear what they need to succeed, our local leaders there make that happen. We see our communities taking ownership of all the projects that we run and then making it successful and sustainable in the long term. Where we have made mistakes in the past, in the early years of our development, is where we have made decisions at this end, decided that we want to trial something actually, and it doesn't work, because if local people there aren't taking the lead, being accountable to themselves and their community, we found that things don't work. So I just love seeing the people in Laura standing up, saying what they need, and then making it happen for themselves and for future generations.
And then how do you measure impact then? So when you're working with those local communities, what's the sort of feedback loop so that you can actually measure what's going on?
We've got an amazing impact manager in Laura. He's a young man of 25 who is outstanding, and he works with all of our hub managers and our specific disability workers to work with community members to gather data, quantitative and qualitative, straight from the ground, which he then analyses and reports back to us.
And have you found that the output from your approach is better than traditional overseas development institutions and groups in terms of what you're actually able to do on the ground?
I mean, I can only speak from our experience, and in the rural communities we work in, we see very little other activity from big charities because it is isolated, it is far away. You know, it's not in conflict or famine, it's chronic, long-term poverty, and there's not many other people working there. But what I can say is that our work absolutely is successful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah, I'm really, really sorry. Order, this session is now closed. Paused. Suspended. Order. We're now going to continue this session of the International Development Select Committee's inquiry into value for money. We're very, very fortunate to have the former Deputy Foreign Secretary, the former Secretary of State, but always the long-term campaigner around ODA, foreign aid, and indeed instrumental in stopping this committee being folded at one point. So you were always a friend to this committee. You've always been very frank to this committee as well. So I hope in opposition you will be able to share some of the experiences that you've had. At the time that we launched this inquiry, we were doing value for money because that's what this committee does, although it very rapidly became the most important topic and hopefully will enable us to shape the government's priorities going forwards. So it feels very timely to have you here in front of us. So I wonder if I could start by asking what your views are on the government's recent announcement to spend just 0.3% of GNI on overseas development assistance.
Well, I was horrified, and you and I were debating this in the House of Commons not many weeks ago, and I was horrified because it's such an error of judgment, and we were all pretty horrified when it was cut from 0.7 to 0.5 because it seems to be a misunderstanding of the huge national interest benefit of development. And we had been through a period in the Foreign Office of coming to terms with the 0.7 cut to 0.5. And we had found ways of multiplying the money, ways of increasing value for money and so forth. And we were just about reaching the point of some success on that, to the point where I was able to say to people, the cut in the money from 0.7 to 0.5 is quite wrong, but we found ways. It is the structure, the abolition of DFID, and the structure of doing development which is causing us the most trouble. Now that's a lack of expertise, the fact that so many people have left, and the quality of the former DFID people who are still in the Foreign Office is very high indeed. But nevertheless, an awful lot of people had gone. And then we left with having managed to find £1 billion for the Global Fund, $2 billion for the Green Climate Fund. We'd penciled in money particularly for Gavi and the World Bank, both of absolute critical importance. And incidentally, the work of Gavi is something which 83% of our constituents applaud. So it's one of the areas of development you don't have to argue so much for. It's actually very popular. And then to see this step being taken, particularly by a Labour government. I mean, I'm not a particularly partisan animal, as you know, Chair, but particularly on this subject. But for a Labour government to do this, I was absolutely horrified, and I can barely imagine what former prime ministers like Sir Tony Blair and Gordon Brown think, let alone people like David Cameron and Mrs May, who were both also strong champions. And we had those four prime ministers in a period of time where British development policy led the world. You could say, without people demurring, that Britain was a development superpower, America a military superpower, Britain a development superpower. And we saw during the period from 1990 to 2020 the fastest decline in international poverty in human history. And for a Labour government to turn its back on all of that and cut in this way, I thought was completely extraordinary.
Can I say that you were absolutely fundamental and foundational in stabilising the development, I can't say department, but the actions that you put in place mean that we do still have those skills. And that's the thing that I'm most concerned about protecting going forwards, because we have some phenomenal experience within FCDO, and I would hate for that to get eroded further. Could I turn to James, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. This inquiry is focused on value for money. And so I wanted to ask, how do you think the UK can ensure that its aid spending continues to offer good value for money in the context of the reduced aid spending which we're now looking at?
Well, the skilled civil servants and diplomats to whom the Chair has just referred are charged with doing that, and they will do that. But there are two particular, very important structural ways in which you do that. The first is through the ICAI. And obviously the committee is extremely familiar with the ICAI, which we set up when we came into government in 2010, because the ICAI is the taxpayer's friend. It is the development watchdog, and because ministers can sweep inconvenient truths under the carpet, it doesn't report to ministers, it reports to you and your committee, and it reports to the legislature, not to the executive, and it is therefore a very important check. And it got very strong support while I was at the Foreign Office, but there might be a tendency among ministers and civil servants to try and emasculate it or erode its power. The way you do that is by cutting its budget. But I would urge this committee to make sure that ICAI is a serious, strong piece on the board, because it's all about value for money. And the other is the new innovation which we brought in 2 years ago, which is the ODA board, which was co-chaired by the Development Minister and by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And that was quite deliberately to drive up the standard of spending by other departments as well as our own, and in particular to bear down on the cost of hotel accommodation for first-year asylum seekers, where the budget was the budget of last resort, and therefore the Home Office could just send round the bill and it had to come out of the budget. I hope the government's going to do something about that now and stop the emasculated development budget being the budget of last resort for that, and make the Home Office carry that particular load. So those are two ways.
How would you address that? Would you look at some form of cap, or do you think it needs to be removed entirely from ODA?
Well, it'll be a matter for the Treasury, although I hope that board, to which other ministers attend and go, the deal is it's chaired one time by the Chief Secretary and then by the Development Minister. I hope the board will come up with its own ideas. But one of the things that everyone on this committee will know, but isn't well understood outside, is that the Foreign Office never went along with this proposal. The Foreign Office know exactly what the impact of this cut will be. This is the Treasury and Downing Street. It's these proposals are not. The idea is that how does the Foreign Office mitigate this or stop it? The Foreign Office will have opposed these dreadful cuts. They will have been imposed by the Treasury and by Number 10. And in order to get that better value for money, the Treasury will have ideas which should be heard loud and clear on value for money. In fact, it was the Treasury who always used to say that DFID did money and the Foreign Office did prose. And there is some truth in that. But the skills of making sure that the money is well spent are very strongly DFID skills. And there are people inside the Foreign Office with that DFID background who are very good indeed at doing that.
And do you think, we've talked about value for money obviously, and we heard from both people that had worked at DFID but then at FCDO after the merger. As you say, I think there's a general acceptance that DFID were very good at this, but the FCDO less so. Do you think that in that merger the arguments become weaker, and that might be one of the reasons why we've seen the slow erosion of appetite to continue to invest in international development?
Well, if you've got a Labour Prime Minister who is cutting development, because if you like, in this, we all know the Labour Party in a way was the backstop. We had to fight pretty hard, but the critical thing is where the Prime Minister stands. So why was it that support for international development went up in the years of so-called Tory austerity between 2010 and 2012? Why did the number of people supporting development go up? It's because you had a very passionate Prime Minister making the case frequently, and quite a passionate development secretary making the case. But you can do it, but it's very, very difficult to do it if you haven't got a Prime Minister championing it. And I remember one of the worst moments in my political career was listening to Boris Johnson announce from the dispatch box in the House of Commons that DFID was like an ATM machine in the sky spewing out taxpayers' money. I mean, if you have a Prime Minister who doesn't back it, a Prime Minister saying something like that, it's very, very difficult to combat the headwinds against development. We live in a country where about half the population think development matters in one form or another, and the other half of the population believe the money is better spent on schools and hospitals in Britain rather than, as people say, sending the money overseas. Of course, that is not what development is, but that argument characterises what people think here, and you have to have at the top the strongest possible leadership explaining why international development is in our national interest. I would argue every penny of the international development budget should be spent in Britain's national interest, and if people think it's not being spent in that way, well, then we should have a very good look at it or refer it to the independent commission. But every single penny should be spent in the national interest.
On that, I've got loads of hands. On that point, under your tenure, do you believe it was spent in the British interest from the bit that you had control of?
Over the last 14 years, my various interventions over that period of time.
All right, do both.
The way we always used to say, much to the irritation of my friend and colleague Douglas Alexander when he was the Development Secretary before 2010, that this wasn't a Labour or Tory policy, it was a British policy, and the one that Britain could be very proud of. And the way I would characterise it is we tried to build on the foundations so ably set up by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and under David Cameron and Mrs May, I think we did do that. But I would argue that the contribution the Tories made was to get the focus very strongly on tackling conflict, stopping it starting, where it started, stopping it, and then where it's over, reconciling peoples, which I think is absolutely in our national interest. And if you look, for example, at what we did in Somalia, very, very difficult. It made life more bearable, particularly for women in Somalia, but it also made us safer on the streets in London and Birmingham too. And then the second thing was building prosperity. And we tried to show the sector, who sometimes regarded the private sector as the enemy of development, that actually the private sector was the engine of development. And so I think I would argue that we did make sure that every penny was spent in the national interest. I was a bit surprised when I got back into government to discover we were still spending money in China, something which the incoming Cameron government agreed would stop on day one.
I've got Brian and then I've got David.
Andrew, staying in a hotel for more than a couple of weeks, it drives anyone mad. For these unfortunate asylum seekers that have come to our shores, it must be a living hell for many of them being in that situation. It's been suggested that these people be allowed to work and be monitored so they don't disappear into the sort of criminal economy. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that might work?
Well, on the specific point about working, I was one of those who was in favour of allowing people to work after 6 months and not a year. But the Home Office argue that if you lower it from a year to 6 months, you increase the pull factor, which is why they were very much against. And those of us who believed that actually that it would cut the cost, as it were, if they could work after 6 months, some of these people are talented and can make that contribution, would be a good thing. We lost that argument.
David.
Just following on from that, you managed to convince the then Chancellor Jeremy Hunt to get round some of the issues around refugee spending with that additional money. Did you, and I appreciate you weren't Home Office Minister, you weren't a Treasury Minister, but do you have views on some of those contracts that were, we feel like there's a lot of waste there in terms of the contracts that were handed out to these big hotel companies. What's your view of that, having been on the inside? Do you think that there is work that the Home Office can do to really to get a grip of those contracts and help reduce the amount of money that is going on refugee costs? Or did you arrive at the sort of uplift that you had with the then Chancellor because there was no way around the amount of money that was being spent on refugees at that point?
Well, the big question was, did I try and argue that none of this money should come out of the budget? It's spent in the UK, and I could have argued that you're spending more money in UK postal districts than you are in Africa from the development budget. And I sort of decided that if I tried to mount that argument, bearing in mind my comments about it is the Treasury that make these decisions, I would be flattened in the rush. So I thought it was better to do a deal with the Chancellor and say, this money on first-year asylum seekers, it is eligible under the DAC, the OECD DAC rules for spending development money. So I will defend it. Indeed, I think I defended it in front of with Treasury ministers here. But so I will not ask for any change. I will accept that. But can we have some money? And we got £2.5 billion. And I hope you won't mind me saying, Chair, I am astonished. I'm amazed that a Labour Chancellor won't at least do what a Tory Chancellor did to soften the blow of all that spending. So that's the first point. The second point is that the ODA board I described was set up specifically because we were so worried about the fact that the money was not being well spent by other departments, in particular the Home Office, but also the local government department. But I have to tell you that Michael Gove did a very good job at pressing down on those costs. We were certainly making progress on that. But we did feel that the bill was sent round, we had to settle it, and more work should be done to try and constrain that spending, get better value for money. And I think we made a bit of progress through that. But the ODA board was absolutely pivotal in driving that forward.
Did you ever do an assessment of the impact of the money going to support refugees in the UK rather than supporting them to be safe in their own homes?
A proper money-orientated assessment, no. But we certainly made the argument that if you want to deal with migration, and it's one of the key arguments I think that one should make now, then you need the development budget because you have to do it upstream. By the time people get to the Mediterranean or the Channel, it's too late. You've got to change the circumstances in the countries from which these people are coming. And that is why I've said in the past that what we really need is a Marshall Plan for North Africa. And because there are people there who will have skills which they can export and which we want and other countries in Europe want. And equally, there's a tremendous need for training. And if you look at the figures for the next few years, the population of Africa is going to rise by something like 650 million. And economists estimate that that at the best we may get 150 million jobs. So that's 500 million, it's an awful lot of feet walking north and looking for work.
I met with the president of the World Bank a couple of weeks ago, and he made exactly that point, that illegal migration is going to be the biggest issue globally unless we do something to keep people safe and prosperous in their own homes. I've got Noah, and then I've got James to come back, and then I'm going to make some progress, if that's okay.
To follow up on that, I think migration, tackling that downstream, is something of a collective action problem in just the same way that climate change is. And given that, as you rightly said, it's in the UK's national interest to get a handle on this and tackle that upstream, how do you, and perhaps you alluded to this with the Marshall Plan idea, but how do you actually do that in a way so that it's not all borne on the shoulders of just one country, Britain, and did you take steps towards that more sort of international cooperation discussion around that?
Well, you'll understand that it's a pretty bleak time for the international system at the moment. It's being smashed to smithereens by President Putin, above all, who, one of the permanent five on the UN Security Council, has invaded his neighbour, destroyed his infrastructure and butchered its citizens. And then it has to be said that President Trump is not, I think, an unavowed supporter of the international system. But, if you go back to 2010, when Britain was leading on international development, we had all these brilliant people like Suma Chakrabarti, Minouche Shafiq, Mark Lowcock, but people throughout the international system who might do a bit of time in DFID and then would go back into the international system. You had real coherence, and people used to come to London. We set up the Multilateral Aid Review, and we had people from Germany, France, Canada, America, Australia coming to London to ask how you make the international system work better to deliver common objectives. So a lot of that has gone, and it makes life much more difficult. But you're entirely right. The idea that Prime Minister Maloney would spend $50 million on trying to do something about people coming across the Med into Lampedusa and into Rome, is for the birds you need a massive amount of investment into North Africa so that people don't feel they need to emigrate. And as an international system, we could do that if we had the will. But the international system is moving in a much more fragmentary way, and narrow nationalism is rampant. And the fact that in order to deal with things like migration, disease, and climate change, you need to have an international system where we all work together, is an argument which is not being internationally won successfully at the moment.
And then perhaps very briefly, is this not our rallying cry, and one that perhaps appeals to some of the people who are losing trust in the idea that there is an international system?
Well, I've tried to make the point in the House magazine, which I think is published today, about the fact that international development is how we tackle, if you're worried about migration, it's how we tackle migration. If you're worried about pandemics, if you're worried about conflict, if you accept that those are things which borders don't often affect, then you need international development. I mean, I think there's lots of other reasons as well, but that seems to me to be an argument that ought to resonate, quite a lot at the moment.
James?
And the points you made earlier about sort of borders and the migration risk coming up from Africa, in the context of our value for money inquiry, how would you be articulating that message into the Treasury right now, where you've got a short-term cost pressure, which is where the economy is, you've got the aspiration to put potentially more money into aid to deal with this potential future issue? How would you be articulating the value for money if you were still the minister responsible?
Well, the first thing I would say is that chopping and changing figures, and we saw this after in 2020 when the first lot of cuts came in, is very, very bad value for taxpayers. Why? Because you don't stop and start programs. If you break them off, you lose a lot of the benefit of the initial investment. And then you restart it again, you have to go out. It's bad value for money. So development is essentially long-term. And that's a point which the Treasury, I think, understand very well. And it's worth remembering, too, that the Foreign Office deals with many more short-term problems. A lot of what these brilliant diplomats do from Britain is to fight fires and to deal with issues as they come up. It's a cultural difference. I mean, they're two sides of the same coin: defence, development, and diplomacy. They all contribute to our national security. But the answer to your question is that stopping and starting development spend is very bad value for taxpayers' money, and we should avoid it at all costs. And I don't know what the committee would think about this, but I would have thought there was some value in persuading the Treasury that rather than, they're not doing this immediately, which is a plus, but rather than from 2027 dropping from 0.5 to 0.3, I would argue that they should drop to 0.4 and then to 0.3 if they insist on this barbaric and ridiculous policy. They should do it in steps, because that will help mitigate the bad value for money for taxpayers, which will result from that cliff edge from 0.5 to 0.3.
We are pressing for clarity over exactly that. Sam?
Thank you. Prime Minister said he's going to go line by line through the budget. Now, we know that 0.3 is actually 0.14, assuming no change in in-country asylum spend. So we're talking 0.14. My question is, which FCDO programmes do you think should be protected against future cuts within that 0.14?
Well, first of all, it's a very good thing that the Prime Minister wants to go through it line by line, and that we should all do that. We should all accept that waste and corruption are the cancers of development spending, because our constituents quite rightly go mad at both. So having a very good look. But he's also said that he will try and protect the expenditure in Sudan. And Chair, I saw the senior figures from MSF last week, and what is happening in Darfur is beyond description. It's so awful. And Britain holds the pen at the UN on Sudan. And so he's right to say that we should continue to focus very heavily on Sudan. Sudan is being pushed aside by what is happening in Ukraine and what's happening in the Middle East. But it really, really matters that we don't neglect this any more than we have already. So I welcome his decision. But, the money, as you yourself said, is finite. And what will happen, I fear, is that having stabilised the bilateral spend, we doubled for this year the spending would double for the bilateral programmes across Africa, and that money will be very well spent. But in the end, if you cut back to this extent, I fear that the bilateral programmes will lose out, because people will seek to protect the World Bank, Gavi, the Global Fund, and also the Green Climate Fund, which I mentioned at the beginning, because we know that those are very, very effective ways of spending British taxpayers' money and getting real results. So when you're faced with the dilemma which you expressed, I very much fear that it's the bilateral programmes above all that will suffer.
But then if I could throw that back to you, if you're having to make those tough financial decisions, the institutions and funds that you named give very good value for money. So should we be prioritising them?
They do or they don't give good value? No, I agree. And that's part of... Example. Yes, but that will be part of the pull away from the bilateral programmes to the multilateral programmes, which, as you rightly say, they do give very, very good value for money.
So with that's what our inquiry is on.
No, but so
should we just be looking at value for money, or what can bilaterals give us that the big multilaterals can't?
Yes, well, I'll tell you exactly what happens. If we withdraw these bilateral programmes, and Britain withdraws from that, and America does, there will be a number of effects, but here are two of them. First of all, the impact, for example, on HIV/AIDS, where America, through PEPFAR, saved millions of lives in the Horn of Africa. That pullback by America and by USAID will have a very serious effect indeed on disease prevention, and in particular HIV/AIDS in the Horn of Africa. So that's one effect. But another effect is political. If we vacate the territory, who do you think will come in? It will be the Chinese and the Russians, and it will be the terrorists, because the thing we learn about this belt of misery across North Africa, stretching, from the terrible things that have been happening in northern Nigeria, through the Central African Republic, through Mali, right the way across until you come to Somalia and even Yemen outside of Africa. That belt of misery where there are 4 or 5 different terrorist movements in operation. They will say, the rich West has deserted you. And this whole thing will be a rich recruiting vein for terrorism. And if you're a woman living in Mali or any of these other countries there, you see the state not as your friend, as we tend to do here, but as hostile, because the state is not a provider of housing or education or prenatal, perinatal health care. These basic things which we take for advantage. The state is often corrupt police officers and so forth who are taking from them. And you take away some of these brilliant bilateral programmes. I launched a £37 million, quite small, fund to tackle exactly that in the Sahel just over a year ago. In fact, I launched it in Niger just before the coup, alas. But the aim of that fund was that it would bring in other countries who shared our analysis, and that way we could help these countries themselves, to understand that is the way you serve your citizens and build that up. You cut the bilateral programmes for the reasons that you very correctly articulated. You will open the space to people who are not friends of Britain, and you will open the space to those who wish us ill.
Warning. David Reid.
Thank you, Chair. And Andrew, thank you for being with us today. It's very beneficial for us to be able to tap into your vast experience on this topic. On that point...
Don't overstate it.
Okay. On that point, there are lessons that can be learned from the last cuts to ODA. So looking back to the 2020-2021 financial year, where we dropped from 0.7% GNI to 0.5%, what do you think the most significant impacts were to our outputs internationally?
Well, they are easily tracked, but they were much worse because there was an immediate cliff edge, and so people who were letting contracts to achieve outputs that you and I would agree are very important were unable to do so, and that's where I referred to the waste of taxpayers' money. But the loss of expertise was also quite marked because of the destruction of DFID. And when I went back into government and into the Foreign Office in 2022, seeing some of these very distinguished figures from the DFID era who'd had real influence and authority internationally, meeting them in the Foreign Office was a bit like meeting people after a nuclear explosion. So it wasn't just the money, it was also the loss of expertise, which meant that you did not achieve those outputs that you describe. And one of the things that we did after 2010 was we said, if you're going to go to 0.7, you've got to be able to persuade people that for every hard-earned pound that comes off their taxes, they're getting 100 pence of delivery output on the ground. It's absolutely vital. It wasn't, to my point in answer to your question, it wasn't just the diminution of the money. The effectiveness, the outputs didn't go down from 7 to 5. What happened was, because of the abruptness, the fact that development is long term, the fact that contracts had to be torn up, and these officials in the Foreign Office who had to administer these contracts and go to long-serving contacts of Britain in countries and say, I'm terribly sorry, we're tearing this up. It's a terrible thing to ask officials to do. And I think many of them suffered significantly from having to enact that terrible policy and terrible mistake that was made at the time.
So linked very closely to that answer, the FCDO has gone through that process fairly recently. You said that lots of people have left since. What lessons do you think were learnt in the last round of cuts? And do you think there are lessons learnt that will be used and applied for this round of cuts?
Well, if I can try and be as positive as possible, the lesson that you don't do it immediately, because these cuts are coming in 2027, that is one piece of good learning, because it means that they won't have to tear up this year's plans, and hopefully not next year's plans either. So that will mean some stability, and that the money that is being spent will be well spent. So that is a good lesson learned. But you can't get away from it, Mr. Reid. The lesson above all is that development is long term. You need stability, and these sorts of chops and changes are anathema to successful development, the successful outputs to which you referred. And therefore they help undermine support for development for that reason amongst our constituents.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today. We're moving on a little bit onto frozen and dormant assets. How do you think those funds and dormant bank accounts and frozen assets could be used to support development objectives?
Well, on frozen bank accounts and so on, I think I don't really know the answer to this, but my impression is that we're not talking about huge sums of money. And on frozen assets, the Treasury are right that you have to make sure you don't undermine the international rule of law by cutting corners on frozen assets, in particular frozen Russian assets, and therefore undermine a collective good. But equally, we should be doing everything we can to use these frozen assets for, in particular, to help Ukraine, but also to help with the development spend. But you have to do it in a legal way. It's very frustrating, the lawyer's insistence on going through the hoops that you go through. It's absolutely essential, otherwise you will get overturned in the courts. And when I went into the Foreign Office, I had huge frustration about how long it was all taking, but I learnt from officials that actually if you try and shortcut, it can all blow up in your face. The other point is that significant use of frozen assets in the way that the EU are talking about it, you need an international consensus. The problem is, I think that they have been advancing, and we've been close to them on this, at the pace of the slowest ship in the convoy. So of the three options they had, they went for the slowest, the least impactful one. But it's an example of where you do need to do things collectively and have an agreement that the frozen assets can be unfrozen and used in a way that we all agree is correct, but also that you're not undermining the rule of law and property rights in doing that.
Can you think of any of the countries that do that well and make the best use of any frozen assets to help deliver development?
Well, I think you'd have to. I think the Americans always seem to be doing it quite well, but I can't really give you a proper answer to that. But I'm sure that if you would talk to Brussels, they would have quite a lot of information on that.
And do you think that's something that the FCDO should be advocating for, a greater use of those types of funds?
Well, they are. I mean, the legal department and the officials in the Foreign Office, they work tirelessly to try and, on sanctioning and on frozen assets and what you can do with them. They are very good, these officials, and they work tirelessly on it. And that was my learning from my time there, was that it can be very frustrating, but there are no shortcuts.
And I guess you've alluded to this, and would that apply specifically to Chelsea Football Club as well?
The Chelsea Football Club is enormously frustrating, and it comes from the fact that when the different interests were tied together to set it all up, they are exceedingly bureaucratic, and it has been extremely difficult to get all the parties into the same place, and there is a nervousness about what would happen, because the final say rests with Abramovich, and I think that I hope, and I've asked some questions about this actually in the House, I hope that we are doing everything we can and doing everything to get that money moving, because it is effectively the second biggest charity in Britain. Only the Wellcome Foundation is bigger. It's an enormous amount of money. Every week the interest racked up is an astonishing sum. And every single sinew should be bent to getting that money out of the door for the purposes for which the licence is intended.
Thank you. We did have a meeting with officials about just this, and they are, from what they told us, straining every sinew. So has
there been any progress there?
I don't know, because I don't know where it was at when you were last there to tell you what the progress was. But they did seem on it, and I'm sure they will also have heard your words on it today as well. Thank you. Noah.
Okay, so turning to other alternative sources, perhaps philanthropy, investment, which alternative sources in your mind can potentially be most effective in replacing some of the efforts that will be lost through traditional ODA?
Well, one of the things we did was to find multipliers for money, which the committee will understand includes doing some co-financing, because if, for example, we and the UAE or we and the Saudis agree together to pursue a target of tackling starvation in Somalia or whatever, and we each put in $25 million, then we are getting 2 for 1 for our taxpayers' money by the fact that we've negotiated and agreed that co-financing arrangement. I think that there's quite a lot of that sort of thing that we should be doing. Secondly, we've managed to use guarantees, billions of pounds of guarantees, to support lending. So, for example, the Africa Development Bank has had guarantees from Britain, and everyone's very happy about making these guarantees, which then mean that they can significantly augment, by more than the face value of the guarantees, the development work that they are doing. So I think that's very important. And also the use of insurance. The insurance pools are now paying out in the Caribbean and indeed in East Africa. This is insurance against weather conditions and so forth. Obviously, you can't do it on a one-country basis for reasons the committee will understand, but you can do it on a wider basis than that, and money is flowing. So thinking above all about ways of multiplying the funds is at the heart of this. And of course, philanthropy has a part to play. When the original cuts were made by Prime Minister Johnson, the philanthropists, and in particular the Gates Foundation and SIF, the Children's Investment Fund, they deliberately put in money to help stop what would have been an abrupt end of a programme that was dealing with children and with disease. And I thought they did a wonderful thing doing that. So there's plenty of things that philanthropists can do. And they are also at the forefront of innovation, the philanthropists. Very important. They come up with ideas which then governments can use and follow. But above all, the answer to your question is this. In the white paper, which we published in November, just over a year ago, that white paper was effectively an all-party white paper. It was blessed by the Labour Party, and it included a lot of important measures which I hope will still be driven forward. The most important of which was, how do you use statist money That's money through DFIs like BII, through the World Bank and the multilateral banks. How do you use the status money to de-risk or help line the billions and trillions of dollars of pension fund money and private sector money which could be released by using the status money in that way? And I used to refer to it in the Foreign Office as the Holy Grail, because that is the way you deliver on this brilliant clarion call from Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, to turn billions into trillions for investment in climate change and so forth. So in the end, it is that use of statist money to drive up the amount of money that the private sector, which is where the real money is, will invest, that you augment our effectiveness and you get the results. And of course, BII, which we very substantially reformed in 2010-2011, and is now, without question, the outstanding DFI, development finance institution in the world, they are brilliantly successful at investing because they invest pioneer money, which goes to places where the private sector is too timid to go to, but also patient finance, which doesn't require a full commercial return. They're required, I think, to make 2%, but I think they've made quite a lot more than that in recent years. But investing that type of money has a really big impact on poverty and in the poorest parts of the world. And in the white paper to which I referred, they are committed to putting up from 37% to 50% the amount of money they are investing in the poorest places. And the impact of this is, when I last looked, the creation of something like 1 million jobs in the poorest parts of the world. That's food on 1 million tables, potentially, but also paying a lot of tax. They pay billions of dollars in tax, these investments, and the tax on the income of people who work within these investments. And of course, that is how states start to build up the capacity to provide services like education and healthcare. Not all that money will be being spent well, but the fact is that is really important in driving up effective results. Sorry.
And breathe. Can I just pull you back to philanthropy and multipliers? We've had evidence from our inquiry from the Eleanor Crook Foundation. Quite surprised that the current government wasn't leaning more into the offer of philanthropy that a number of organisations have made. We've also had evidence from the APPG on Aid Match about how they haven't really been used as much as they could in recent years. I wonder, on those sort of two specifics, if you could give your thoughts on why we seem to be stepping away from what would seem to be quite obvious values for money.
Well, first of all, Aid Match, I completely agree. We invented it when we came into government in 2010. And the reason why Aid Match is so brilliant is because it is an augmenter, as you've said. It's a multiplier. And basically, at its best, it's an offer to taxpayers of 2 for 1. Bog off. Buy one, get one free. So Aid Match should be supported and has done some brilliant stuff. So if the committee conclude that more should be done on Aid Match, I hope that it would be roundly supported. On your other point, when we did the Nutrition Summit also in November 2023, the philanthropists came in. Indeed, they underwrote the costs of the summit, Gates and SIF. And Eleanor Crook Foundation, which does food above all else, was very involved as well. And it's not just their money, but it's also their inventiveness. And Eleanor Crook has done a lot on that. And these people, are amazing in what they do. And if you look at what Sir Chris Hahn has done at SIF and the causes he has supported, I think he's Britain's highest paying taxpayer. But look at the work that the foundation that he set up has been able to do to help tackle poverty and drive up basic standards of life for people who live in the most terrible conditions. And you see the enormous value that philanthropists provide.
What do you think the hesitancy is then?
What do I think?
The hesitancy is about partnerships with them.
Well, you're mixing oil and water. You're mixing two different types, and you have to be very careful that you get it right. Otherwise, both parties are offended. So, it can be difficult. But given the position we're now in, heading down towards point 3, the importance of doing that is all the more clear.
I'd agree.
Yeah. I have a few more questions around the kind of fungibility of these different sources. I mean, in your mind, where is it that development finance can step in to fill that void left by ODA, and where can it not do so?
Well, it can't. First of all, there are some people who say government shouldn't be involved in this. It should be down to charities and philanthropic organisations. And what that misses is the national interest point we were talking about earlier. There are some things only governments can do. Philanthropists can't really operate in the councils of the United Nations. It is governments who need to make these decisions. Government needs to pull other governments together, other sources of taxpayers' money. So there is a difference, and the thing to do is to try and get the best out of both sides of that equation, without choking on the pith.
And on this point of national interest, how does that sit against what a lot of people are calling for, which is a localisation agenda, a partnership approach that's been increasingly prized in the sector?
So I would argue. Can we continue?
You want
to? So your question is, how do you?
A lot of people are calling for a localisation or partnership.
So my answer is this. If you look at the white paper, we are absolutely clear about the critical importance of localisation. And the reason why localisation is absolutely in our national interest is that if you don't have two partners who are agreeing on the best way to achieve the results, which Mr. Reid referred to, then it doesn't work. And we saw that. That used to happen before. We saw that countries would fill in the right forms. They knew what they had to say to get the money, but they wouldn't necessarily use the money in the way that was expected, and they never got the results. So localisation is about both parties agreeing on a common objective and then delivering in order to get the results that we and they want to see.
The briefest of briefists from
Yeah,
David.
very quickly, special drawing rights. Liam Byrne, among others, think that we should try and match what Spain are doing. Think that could get another $4 billion on the table. What do you think, and why do you think the Treasury has been so resistant in the past to do it?
So in looking at this, you have to put a cold towel around your head. It's extremely complicated, but Britain is not in the same pace as the European Union, particularly because of contingent liability and requirements. And Jeremy Hunt, who was very interested and very supportive in principle, he and I spent a lot of time on this, and in the end we concluded that we couldn't do it. But of course, he did use the SDRs in the traditional way. I think from memory something like £6 billion went into IMF funds which were bent on trying to help reduce poverty. And so we have used them well, but in the particular way to which I think you are referring, I fear that the Treasury rules and the Bank of England rules as well mean that we're not going to make rapid progress on that.
And on that point, as ever, you've been incredibly helpful to this committee. We deeply, deeply appreciate your contributions in here, out there, and on the international stage. So thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Yeah, here.
This session is now closed. Order.